Okay, we're set. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth seminar of our city seminar series. This year theme is urban guilds, and we explore our topic this year through three main sub-themes, which is places as uh, cultural clusters, and then places of vernacular creativity, and then hyper guilds in alternative spaces. We are actually happy to be joined today with architect Christophe Bouleau from the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. Christopher will share with us today the vernacular tradition and creation of earthen architecture in the city of DJENNE, Maui. Christophe Bouleau holds a master's degree from the Department of Architecture in the Swiss Institute of Technology of Lausanne. And he specialized in monument preservation at the center of the Poste et de Chaulier in Paris. His career began in historical monuments preservation in France and Italy, and he has been working in archaeological and monuments conservation projects in Singapore, Malaysia, Mexico, and Egypt. He has been working at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture Historic Cities Program as a conservation architect stationed in Cairo in charge of Darb al-Ahmar district monuments conservation program between 2010 and 2007. He has also been contributing to the architectural documentation and conservation projects in Aleppo and Damascus, Syria since 2008. As a conservation project officer, he oversees from the trust base in Geneva conservation and architectural programs in West Africa and provides technical assistance to the wider Aga Khan development network. Well, over to you, Christophe.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I would like to thank the Cambridge City Seminar for inviting me and to speak to all of you. And so I'm a conservation architect, I'm a practitioner. I will let projects speak for some ideas. So this presentation is going to offer you a journey in Mali, to Mali in West Africa. So the idea is to try to, let's say, use a case study in Djenné, which is a mid-sized city in the center of Mali, to illustrate, let's say, some concepts of vernacular architecture, tradition, earth architecture, and so on. So this presentation is going to touch upon the following themes. The first theme is vernacular architecture. So what is vernacular architecture? It's a category of architecture without architects. So it's developed by communities and it reflects local needs, traditions, and builders. So it's a very special type of architecture in the sense that it has only recently been, let's say, codified internationally, and the Charter of the Built Vernacular Heritage in 1999 is there to remind us about, let's say, the main principles. So the idea is not to only embrace the physical form and fabric of buildings, but also to put emphasis on traditions and the intangible associations to the building. Then second concept is, what is tradition? Because tradition brings always an idea of transmission and the passing of, let's say, elements of culture to one generation to the next, but by verbal communication, not written. So tradition is never written. And then, because architecture is interested with buildings, first, we are going to touch upon the Banco tradition. So Banco is mud architecture in Mali. So it's a wet mud building process that is very special to West Africa. in the sense that it's really because of the quality of the mud in the inner Niger Delta that you can manufacture this banco. So it's a very old tradition. It's the first examples of banco being used for buildings is the 3rd century after Christ in Mali, in archaeological sites. But I mean, everyone knows that, I mean, in Egypt, the Ramesseum has some earth architecture elements 14 centuries before Christ. So it's a very old method of working. Then I will touch upon another subject, which is the genius of the place, or genus loci. Genus loci is inevitably associated with Norbert Schultz in the 70s. But the idea is that, I mean, the genus loci talks about the intangible quality and material of place. So we will be touching these aspects. And the idea is that preservation will not only deal with the physical monuments, but also with the intangible values. So before we move on to the presentation, I would like just to explain you what is the Aga Khan Development Network, because it's not very widely known. So it's a not-for-profit organization guided by His Highness the Aga Khan, and it's a group of development agencies and institutions working primarily in Asia and Africa to address, let's say, the needs of the most vulnerable society and the poor people. So we implement our strategies in the idea to achieve for the communities a level of self-reliance and improve the quality of life. So buildings, restoration are meant to improve quality of life, simply. This is what is the intention. So the Aga Khan Development Network works in many countries in Asia and Africa, and the area where I'm going to talk about this evening is Mali. So Mali in West Africa is really at the extreme west of our interest. Mali is a country, it's a landlocked country. It has no sea border, and it is a country which has, let's say, which is marked by a valley of the Niger, the Niger Valley, which finishes in the Guinea coast. So the context of Mali, simply we talk about a period of projects between 2004 and 2019. So it's 15 years of activities on different subjects, mainly on earth architecture, but also on urban upgrading. And in Bamako, a park was fully rehabilitated with a zoo between 2008 and 2013. So we have been active in this country for 15 years, which is more or less what the period you can achieve sufficient critical mass of change. So why Mali is special? Simply because it has inside the inner Niger Delta. So this delta is it's a wetland, a zone of wetland and lakes, rivers, which is being flooded during the rainy season and after the rainy season, and where due to the Niger and Bani water discharge. So Then I also put a climate graph because I thought it's quite important, because you see in the blue bars, they mark the rainfall. So rainfall is focused in between July and September mostly, and while the temperature is quite stable. So this is the context. Then I'm going to make a small parenthesis in Timbuktu, because Timbuktu as a mosque is a very, Timbuktu Jinga River Mosque is a very important building. And because it's the oldest mosque in Mali, built in 1345, so in the 14th century, it is one of the most important landmark in the country. So you see in this early 20th century photograph that this building suffers from, let's say, dilapidation already. And what is very interesting is that the location of this mosque is in Timbuktu, is at the extreme limit north of the Niger Delta and just south of the Sahara. So it uses some materials from the mud tradition in the Delta, but also some materials coming from the nearby desert, sand, stones, and so on. So always, let's say, in vernacular traditions, materials don't come from far away. They are not industrial. They all come from the nearby environment. So if I take a small, this is a historical lithograph explaining how old Timbuktu is, and that the first travelers who came were always very fascinated by the culture of manuscripts and all the scholars which were there in the 13th to the 16th century. So when we started a conservation project in 2007, and like in all cases in Mali, the first thing that happens is dialogue with the community. So the imam is there, yeah. He is the chief of the mosque, and surrounded by his important dignitaries of the community. So basically, you must explain a project, listen to their feedback, and adjust your view of, let's say, how you would like to implement the project to what you receive from them. And this is a given for most projects in Mali, is that the social interaction with the community is a prerequisite. And then you can start your technical work. And the technical work in a restoration project always starts with surveys and documentation. It's a way, let's say, to collect the data and understand how the building is. It's like, I mean, a doctor examining a patient. So you make surveys and you take time to understand how to make the mapping of the damages and understand how to solve them. So what is interesting is that when you start also a project, you have to listen to the local masons, who are the tradition bearers. They know where to find materials, and they know the quarries. They know how to prepare materials. So the first thing is to go and visit quarries. This on top is a mud quarry, which you see the color is very dark. It's a black banco, which is very good for the finishes. Then on the right, you see a quarry for stones, because you see these stones in almost a desertic environment are necessary to build. So this is a start. You start to identify the sources of building materials, and you need the masons, the local traditional masons, to guide you in this process. And it's also time for testing. So you test on wall samples some of the possible, let's say, mixes to see what the level of shrinkage or the level of success that they have. And you start to prepare material, you start to shape them, because what is interesting is that it's a very, let's say, labor-intensive activity. And you see that, I mean, you don't take industrial materials at all, but you extract materials from a nearby environment, shape them, and prepare them to be built. So on top you have this is a tank where the banco is put with water and is mixed by human feet. Yeah, and then the stones are being dressed and made ready for the builder to assemble them with mud. These are a few pictures of the work progress to understand more or less how things take place. To illustrate, I mean, this vernacular traditions of a stone building assembled with mud. This is the roof. So the roof, you see, it basically is made of very simple palm tree beams covered with this vegetable fibers that we take from the small forest remaining in the environment. So, and then it's covered by mud bricks and liquid mixes. What happens sometimes is that you make discoveries. And because you pass electrical wires on the floor, you start to make test pits, and you discover archaeology. So you bring specialists, and we have been very fortunate to find the remains, the first mosque being built in Timbuktu, 3.5 meters underneath the existing one. So, and with a type of architecture that is absolutely not common, and no one knows what are the similarities. And what was fortunate is to have kept an element of coal that we were able, let's say, to analyze with the C14 analysis, and they demonstrated that, I mean, these remains were built really in 1340 to 50. So we came to it. And these are a few pictures of the completed conservation, you see, just to illustrate. Yeah. So it's time to move to Djenné, to the real topic. The idea was to make you a small, let's say, journey in Timbuktu to understand the kind of, let's say, old historical special mosque. Djenné is a different case. Djenné is really located in the core of the Niger Delta. You see, it's really in the middle, where it's only mud is available, and very good mud. So it's a mid-sized city, which is a peninsula. So this is an aerial view, which explains well how this city is. So it's a city surrounded by water, which is flooded. So the flood affects it greatly, because when water is high, there is only one way to enter the city, through a bridge. And when the water is low, you can more or less, I mean, access everywhere by car. So it's a dense urban fabric with no possibility to expand. So people are limited to what they can. And so it's surrounded by the Bani River. And maybe you see in the middle on the following plan, this is a plan of Djenné, marked by really, let's say, this mosque. This central mosque is really a very special mosque surrounded by an open space, which is a market square. And so what we are going to speak about is about the restoration of the mosque and urban upgrading of the area in the south of the mosque. So this is the mosque, the Djenné Mosque, before conservation. You see, at the end of at the beginning of the 20th century, of the 21st century, first century. So it's a big building. It's a very big building in the sense that it's not common in Mali to have large mosques like this and tall mosques. It's about 10, 15 meters high and 2,000 square meters of a floor plan. And it has not always been like this, because the site was occupied for a long, long time by previous mosques that became eroded by rain and became totally just like ruins. And this is the oldest image we have of the earlier mosque of Djenné. And when in 1906, there was a start, the existing mosque was started to be constructed, it reused some of the pre-existing building parts. So these are postcards of the early 20th century that really show how the building was at the time. And the construction continued. And a few years after 1907, when it was completed, we have a few photographs in postcards about the building completed. So you see, it really rises above the skyline of the low skyline of the urban fabric. And here you see more or less the scale of the building compared to the people in front of it. And it has a very large platform which has recycled the previous buildings' remains. So this is the view in the middle of the 20th century. You see, nothing has changed drastically. Society is still very traditional, no vehicles, nothing, which is a big change in the early 21st century, because then it's full of colors and modern materials and risks. So this is the Monday market. So every Monday there is a market on the market square in front of the mosque, and it's a very lively market, and people come from all the neighboring towns to sell products and buy products. And every Monday it's hundreds of people, and they lack facilities. Nothing is organized for them. There is no restrooms. So people complain a lot about this. I'm first going to touch upon this conservation project, because you will notice that this conservation project was not absolutely only conservation. It was much about social and anthropological research. So first of all, this building, the way it is, maybe you have a roof plan on the right with the large market square in front of it, and the ground floor plan with the very important place given to the structure. The structure is very thick, simply because the mud requires a lot of thickness to support compression. So this is more or less how the mosque is. So it's a building that was in an acceptable condition from the appearance, but turned out to be quite dilapidated. So what was the problem mainly? It's because additional layers of Banco over the years, over 100 years, made a crust hiding the structure. So when the structure was in bad condition, simply you could not really access it because it was covered with a thick layer. And this thick layer is almost 20 centimeters thick. So one of the challenges was to decide to remove this crust to be able to assess the stability and the level of conservation of the building. And the roof was the same case. The roof was overloaded by, we have estimated about 500 tons of Banco added over the years, which had to be removed because the beams were totally in bad condition because of this load. And you see the roof, the level, the difficulty was also to find a way to drain the rainwater. So what happened initially was simply to remove the additional crust to access the masonry and understand if there was a need to stabilize it. And in the same time as exposing the structure, then came the issue of, let's say, manufacturing bricks, because you see, maybe you have never seen bricks like this, huh? These are bricks which are like small cylinders, like yogurt pots. Huh? They are called Djenné. They are specially made in Djenné, and they are made of mud, of organic product like a fruit of the baobab, which is crushed and plays a role in the stability. And it's purely handmade. So you see the masons, they are seated almost, and they manufacture bricks by thousands, simply because and the way of building is very special, because it's like, I mean, putting together those kind of small cylinders on thick walls and layers of mud, like you see layers of mud, layers. So it's very time consuming and very, let's say, very labor intensive, but it's a very traditional element, and only local masons, they know how to manufacture them. So you see here, same story. The main tool is the hand. You use a trowel to distribute the mud, but mainly hand is the only tool. And you repair the bricks, you repair the missing zones and the zones which are unstable by fixing them with this Djenné technique. And not only are the bricks laid horizontally like this, but they are also stabilized by wooden studs, which are inserted in the buildings to try to provide some anchoring for this system. Because this system has the inconvenient to create big cavities inside the walls where the termites can go up. Also some examples of roof, how the roof is done. So the roof is done with palm tree beams, which are, let's say, cut into 4 and to create beams. So it's a very labor intensive activity also, because most of the beams have to be replaced because palm tree beams are not meant to be wet a long time, because then they become totally unable to sustain the loads. And the tradition is simply to, let's say, repair the roof and then lay on top of it layers of banco stabilized with organic products to create water insulation. And this is only with materials coming from nearby environments. So this is the result of a roof after it's finished. You see the skylights, those 109 skylights. They are made in burnt brick, burnt on terracotta. So this is the only case of, let's say, mud being burnt. Otherwise, all mud is used just as raw, but without being baked. And here you see more or less people at work. So this lady, Khadija, she makes those skylights simply by hand and prepare them one by one and burnt them in an oven with grass being burnt. And the person on the right makes the finishes of the plaster. You see this kind of dark gray plaster. It's this banco noir, black banco, which is the finishes, and it's applied by hand. It's only a hand practice. And the result after conservation, you see, basically, what is interesting is that it's a slimming exercise for the mosque, which has re-established its natural, let's say, slim pillars and its original system. And you see, maybe it's interesting to see the before and after, because this is also what is interesting with vernacular architecture, is that, I mean, you don't have any objective in mind as an architect. You just follow local traditions and local habits, and you try to accompany them. So you see on the left, the building was very thick. The curves were very round, and there was a crust all on this building of some 100 years of banco. On the right, after conservation, you see the building has gained a certain level of, let's say, integrity. And it plays better with light, and it is being strengthened. But nothing would be sustainable if there was no maintenance. And the key operator with the mason is really, let's say, the person who has the total control and maintenance. So the maintenance process in Djenné is a festival. It's a festival which has all the community around the mosque, and it's like a competition between each district to have the best way of plastering. So it's announced by drums, you see. It's a festival. It's a community festival every year. So every year, they have all the community carries banco to replaster the mosque, because it has been eroded after the rainfall. So people are ready to carry the mud. So you see, population is quite young. And an interesting aspect is that only women carry water. So men build, but women bring water. So there are some unsaid traditions that accompany this crépissage. So you see those pictures, they are very self-explanatory. So people climb on ladders and and they replaster the upper part of the mosque from top to down, and with large crowds around them, bring them mud and having this kind of festival. You see, so people are covered with mud simply because they run from one place to the other, and everyone plays a role in it. And at the end of this replastering, you see the mosque is still wet, but basically the surface has been redone to sustain the next rainy season. And this is a very important element because the replastering campaign is where the traditional mason is really showing its main strength. Because the traditional mason, he doesn't have only, let's say, a technical role, but he has also secret powers and rituals to protect buildings from evil or dangerous spirits. So masons, they have their way of, let's say, putting amulets or, let's say, doing some good to your building if you treat them well, or doing some bad if you treat them badly. So they do not have only, let's say, technical knowledge, but they have a role as a corporation or a guild, if we want. So they maintain the professional standards. So for them, the quality is really, let's say, what drives them. So the quality of mud and the quality of practice. They control the vocational training, so they have apprentices and they transfer knowledge to their apprentices, and no one else can challenge them. They are the tradition bearers. Then they distribute the work, and when there is a project, this guild of masons, they are the ones who decide who should work on such a project or not. And they especially organize this yearly maintenance campaign. And this guild in Djenné is probably the best example in Mali because it's a very active one, and it's called the Bariton. So they are very well organized. And what is interesting in a country which is still at a certain standard quite poor is the high level of sophistication of the collective representation, and the fact that they have governance bodies inside the community with different corporations for truck drivers, for women selling on the market, for all different trades. They have people representing them. So when you want to discuss something, you always have interlocutor who is valid. So something as a problem in Djenné is that, I mean, there are some byproducts of modernity, which is solid waste. And the idea was not only to work on historic buildings, but also put an emphasis on the surrounding communities and improving their quality of life. And the quality of life of communities come from potable water, access to potable water, sanitation, solid waste management, and all urban problems that are not being dealt with by municipal authorities. So the first idea was to try to show to the municipal authorities their problem, because they get used to them. So the idea was to simply, as a process, tell them if they think it is the best way to deal with urban issues. So you see, on these pictures, you see open drains like this, or let's say the river bed surrounded by waste. And open drains don't work simply because they are full of waste. And so young children cannot go out of their home without risk of falling into the open drains. So these are simply things that if you fix them, you improve the quality of life drastically. And something else also is that in spite of the respect for community building as the Congregational Mosque, there has always been, let's say, parking all over and neglect on the public space. And you see after the Monday market, people stayed a long time, buses came. It's always, let's say, without respect for the place. And when rain came, the bad rainwater management meant that it was quasi impossible for pedestrians to cross the Monday Market Square, simply because it was full of water and being not drained properly. So simply showing those pictures was a way to open the eyes of authorities and communities on what could be done to improve their lives. Example, solid waste accumulated simply by neglect and by bad management. So what came as a process was simply to see how we can, let's say, advance some ideas and having, let's say, the community endorsing projects and giving opinions and on the order of priorities. So as you see here, we prepared a kind of very simple concept plan, which was meant to have, let's say, a pedestrian place in the Monday Market Square and limit the vehicular traffic to only this loop. The idea was to drain rainwater properly to the Bani shores and to replace all the sanitation systems to have a much better underground sewage to free up the open space and stabilize the Bani shores so that people can go and wash, so that the women can go and wash their clothes without jumping on solid waste, and which is always the case. So this was a way, let's say, to start discussing. And so it took probably 3-4 months of dialogue with the community, not knowing exactly what people would tell. And the idea was to not let them talk in the vacuum, but try to bring them to the idea of improving their lives and that they make the project their own. And this has been the key to the success. And it took lots of time. You don't control anything in this period when you discuss with people, because there are large crowds of people expressing ideas, and you have to pick up most of what is necessary to address each query. And then you try to advance your designs little by little, always informing them and showing them what can be done, what is more important. And so in Djenné, so this is more or less a schematic plan that shows, let's say, the mosque, the market square, the Bani shores, and we decided to create a prototype project because we couldn't deal with the entire city because the city was much too large to be, let's say, fully restored, but to try to demonstrate that it was feasible. And so very soon, the main component of the project that required attention for the community was the solid waste management. Solid waste meaning that, I mean, we had not anticipated to do so much of the solid waste, but it required a lot of interest, simply also because people had never been able to address this. So we had to bring specialists to study behaviors. Who takes the solid waste out of the household and brings them? Where does they bring them? What is it about? Why do they put all the waste on the shores, on these points? So we discovered that the main actors of the solid waste management are the women, simply because they are the ones who take the waste out of the home. And it was really a matter of, let's say, understanding more how to change behaviors and help them with better systems. So you see, there was waste everywhere, and we brought an environmental consultant from Mali who studied very well all the, let's say, anthropological aspect also of the waste, because it goes down to the level of habit. So we discovered this very simple graph shows you that, I mean, shops didn't create anything. The Monday market was just creating very little waste, but the main source of waste, which was 5,000 tons, was created by households. And the second graph shows you that 73% almost of the waste is made of organic products, so can be compostable. So this was one of the good news, in the sense that most of the waste can be compostable, and only very little was to be burned. So to deal with solid waste is a long cycle from the household to the final discharge. And you have to look at, let's say, first, how to collect the waste and to be close to as close as possible to the households, so that they feel interested to deposit their waste in a point which is organized for this. So we developed a series of, let's say, collecting points based on, let's say, the density of people dropping their waste by a survey. And we built simply very simple deposits. And then came the question of how to carry them. So there was a discussion with authorities and communities. People thought they would like to have vehicles, trucks, like in our countries. Simply, the density of the urban fabric didn't make it possible to access to the solid waste points with trucks, because trucks require at least 2.5 meters to pass. So we opted, after 10 different experiments, to the solution of donkey carriages, because the donkey carriage is the most practical and cheap solution to go everywhere. And so the deal we found after months and months of trials and errors was that, I mean, the operator of the donkey carriage would work for the community in the morning, so controlled by the district leaders, community leaders. And if the work is well done in the morning to carry out the solid waste, the person can work for his private activities in the afternoon. So it was a way, let's say, to create a kind of incentive to maintain well the property. And you see down the creation of the final discharge on a place that was not which could not be flooded, which had been very well studied to be accessible without difficulty. Only a problem came because when the city is flooded during the rainy season, one of the access to the final discharge is being flooded like this, as you see here. So we had to equip the city with a pedestrian bridge for the donkey carriages to access directly all year round the final discharge. Because if you do not, let's say, make it simple for people and convenient to deal with solid waste, you can be sure that nothing is going to be sustainable. So that was an unexpected activity that took place. And you see the level of this pedestrian bridge is about 250 meters long and is double. You can cross with donkey carriages, and basically it provides direct access between two areas of one village and the city all year round also. So it has really changed the way of life for people. Then was another dimension to the project is the rainwater runoff system that was not at all working. So I will not show you too many plans, but we had to work with plans to try to use gravity to capture, let's say, rainwater and bring it to the river. And so you see, it was simply improving the, let's say, rainwater runoff system by rebuilding the channels, the covered channels. And then we dealt also with the solid waste, the sanitation, because you see that, I mean, sanitation has never been very well dealt with. And so sanitation simply because open drains create lots of problems for the people. We had to think about an underground sewage system, like in most countries, but in Mali, things are not always the case. So with manholes, simply you see manholes and PVC pipes put under below grade, simply. And with a sedimentation tank, where let's say the effluent can stabilize before the water is being discharged. So it's a very simple gravity system, which was needed at the time. So what was implemented was this network going into the effluent treatment plant here. So it affected probably 800 persons and about 70 households. Yeah. So then was also a dimension that was very much needed because of solid waste accumulated. You see solid waste everywhere, and that was a problem. So we thought that in this pilot project, we would stabilize the shores, the river shores, to at least provide a decent access and relationship between the city and the water. And so technically speaking, we used a gabion technique, simply because you can adjust, you can adapt to the size of the place very simply, and it can be done locally with chicken wire simply. So that was the advantage of the system, and it was labor intensive, and it provided lots of jobs, employment. So you see more or less people filling the gabions, crowds of people working, using crushed blocks, and at the end, this provided a certain level of, let's say, peaceful open space for people to enjoy the space between water and the city. And boats could be used directly from carriages to go into the bunny. So you see, the quality of life is really the driver. So implemented work, I show you a plan at least to understand the scale of things. It's not small, and even if it's only a portion of the city, things are quite large. And the final dimension of this urban upgrading project was to pave the market square and treat it for pedestrians. And so we used baked bricks because this created a lot of employment also in the community, because we had 10 different suppliers to be able to provide them. So the main accesses were made of red burnt brick, clay bricks, and the filling was done with banco. So that, I mean, we keep more or less the same spirit for the open space. And this gives you more or less the final result. So finally, people could enjoy at least an open space that was not disturbed by traffic. We created some benches around so that people can sit, you see them. Those benches were also a kind of barrier to avoid cars and trucks to enter in this place. So then life suddenly was changed for young people, for kids, and to play. And you see more or less how you can easily change and improve the quality of life by urban upgrading. So I think that's my final slide. And then I would like to invite you to a discussion about on my conclusion. I would like to ask you to come back to the question raised for the seminar, if it's a place of vernacular creativity. More generally, if a city should be carefully planned, or should it be from a self-organization of the people? And how do we see or imagine a creative urban future? So my first reaction to this is very simply that, I mean, the context commands. Simply, when you work in some developing countries or in urban countries which are quite advanced, town planning and urban strategic decisions are valid. But when you discuss with earth architecture in Mali, earth architecture is simply a community activity. So you can only adapt the bottom-up approach. And you have to be ready to and humble to give up your architectural wishes and listen to the people. And always remembering that you serve the community, you work for the people, and you improve their quality of life and self-reliance. And the traditional Masons Guild are here to help and to be reinforced, because they are the ones who will guarantee sustainability. And is it creative? Difficult to say. It's not creative, but it's a lesson that I think for us is valid in many of our contexts on the social value of the cohesion, on the social cohesion of society, which guarantees sustainability. And the intangible common values sometimes for society are more important than only rational town planning. So these are more or less my directions for discussion. And I think that we can open the floor to questions and answers now.
Thank you, Christophe, for such an amazing and inspiring presentation. I mean, and such rich content. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of effort to say you've been working in like challenging setting, and then facing many obstacles. And this what a transition we made, because like last week we were talking about Venice and the challenges in Venice and the role of urban guilds in medieval times. And then when we transitioned to Bali, which is such a completely different context, and we see how we have well-established and like formalized guilds who have such a prominent role and participating in shaping the built environment. So the floor is open now for questions. Please post your questions in the chat. And we have our first question now, which is, so what kind of organic stabilizers do the masons use for earth mix? I think, yeah.
So this is a technical question, which is really in my field directly. So organic products vary from one area to the other, but generally you can classify them into, let's say, straw, fibers, and rice chaff, which is really, let's say, the fibers. They make the skeleton for the banco, for this earth. And then there are a number of organic additives, such as the karité butter, or let's say the what is it? It's called. There are nuts. There are black nuts that can be crushed, and that create also, let's say, bond for the. They are called nere in Mali. Then you have also, let's say, the fruit of the large trees, which can be, let's say, crushed and form a very solid stabilizer. The main aspect, or let's say using karité butter or other product, is that you reinforce your final plaster, and you can, let's say, have a more durable system to sustain the water, the rainwater erosion.
Okay, thank you. So we have a second question, just from Gary. It says, I saw this kind of technology in Africa in some webinar last time. Is this really originating in the tribal dwellings in Africa?
So is it, can you please repeat? I just try to understand. Yeah.
So basically the question is about this technology in buildings. So the question, is this really originating in the tribal dwellings in Africa?
It's originating, you see, it's interesting because in the reality, it's a combination between, let's say, the availability of the mud product because of the riverbed of the Niger Valley and the Bani, and a tradition of construction that derived from the availability of material. So it's not really ethnically grounded, because all social groups built with Banco, and there is no special, let's say, ethnic group able to build with it. It's something very well shared. It's mostly, let's say, for rural areas, simply because in the cities, there is no more Banco available to build. And there are some programs that you cannot build with mud, like hospitals, simply for help.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question from Shahira. How do we address the threats climate change poses to the availability of indigenous material, vernacular architecture, among other changes?
So changes. So you have a lot of social changes in a society of in development. And the main challenges for earth architecture comes from the rapid social changes in society, the fact that the urbanization doesn't respect, let's say, traditions anymore, that, I mean, people do not, let's say, pay lots of respect for a tradition which is perceived as sometimes old-fashioned or only for the poor, and the need of urban citizens to have, let's say, a completely different style of life. And so these are the main challenges, because the weather erosion is something that has always taken place. And Masons Guild have always been able to deal with them easily by replastering, you know. But more and more, the young generations are less interested to sustain this kind of activity.
Okay, so I mean, before we move to the other questions, I would like to ask you a question. So when we look at these forms of participation, especially where it's gendered, where like women carry water and men carry the materials and all of these. So I'm just wondering, are these actions, are they informed by institutional forms of guilds, or are they, or do they come out of, you know, individual kind of?
So when you convene an information session for the community leaders, there is always one coordinator. And very often the coordinator is the chief of the Masons Guild, because he is your closest partner in the building process. But when it comes to working with solid waste or urban issues, then you deal with a larger number of people, and very often you need to have one focal point to convene the others. And we use very often the state representative, because at the end, the state is has very limited role in the country, and the communities have the most important role. So the state, if you do not involve, let's say, representative in your process, they feel like marginalized. So they are the ones who, let's say, convene the community, so at least they feel a role in endorsing a project. So you see, there is never one way or the other to do it. There are plenty of ways, and you have to open your eyes and ears about how people think. Yeah.
So we have a question now about the interior space of the mosque. So thank you very much for your talk. I was fortunate to visit Djenné in 2010 and recall seeing work in progress on the Great Mosque. Could you please talk more about the covered interior space of the mosque and how it accommodates congregational Muslim worship?
Yes, I have not been, I didn't find very good pictures of the interior, simply, but the interior of this mosque is, maybe I should go back to those slides. It's better to have, let's say, supporting documents, at least, so you see. This is the mosque, huh? Yeah. It goes too far. Okay. Sorry. So the interiors are made of, let's say, vaulted, very high vaults, and they accommodate about 1,000 people for prayers, for Friday prayers. And one of the first interests by the community for the interiors was to get rid of the colony of bats that were living on the ceiling. So during daytime, the bats, they are large bats. There were 800 bats suspended to the ceiling and creating lots of, let's say, trouble to the people on the carpets. And we didn't expect such a thing, but this came up by that it was the most important thing. So we had to deal with, let's say, a way to exclude bats without having any, let's say, animal, we simply by closing one window after the other and bringing them outside without destructions. So the interior has been, let's say, always used the same way during the project, because I mean, we maintained always the prayer, the Friday prayer, and worked on one section after the other. So the idea is that a project must not be disruptive for a community. There's a big risk that if you do not take care of, let's say, where you work and with whom, you can create dissensions and conflicts. So an example also, on the project, the chief of the village, which is the biggest authority from the community, asks us to make rotations of personnel. So imagine that, I mean, you have 180 workers and masons, and every 3 months, you should get new ones. So we finally managed to keep about a core group of 60, and every 3 months we had 120 masons, newcomers on the building site. The idea being that the project should benefit to the entire community, and there should not be, let's say, conflicts, because there is more employment given to this group versus the other. So you can trust the communities to distribute well, let's say, the workload, so that, I mean, you do not disrupt the social activity, the social context.
Okay, so we have also a fairly technical question now, which is, so what is the typical column size and the typical span in between columns?
Typical span.
The restoration, and then we see like...
Yeah, maybe I should go back to the first. Okay, so in this picture, you see that the span is never more than 2 meters 60. It is given by the capacity of the palm tree to, let's say, hold, to be stable under the load of a roof. So it's the same case in Timbuktu. The span is never wider than 2 meters 60. And this is really what limits the the dimension of each row of a mosque. It is the span of the palm tree.
Mm. Okay, and we also have an interesting question. So, do the policy and building codes in Mali allow for architects to build with earth in cities? So,
That's a very good question, because this is one of the threats for earth architecture, is that building codes and of practice, they don't allow in this country, in Mali, to build with mud and to get a license to build. So in some countries like Germany, I know France, um, the actors of urban architecture have been able, let's say, to pass a, a codification to the main corpus of the standards, to have the capacity to build with earth. But in Mali, it's a very, you don't get any license, building license to work. Huh? The community gives you the license to work.
mm,
So it's a it's a very urban question, the building license. But it's true that, I mean, without codification and standards of practice, you cannot really build with mud and get a licensed building.
mm. Interesting. So, I mean, this actually leads me to a follow-up question in a way. I'm just assuming that, so we have a couple of entities working, for example, in a city like Djenné. So we have the state with the codes, and we have the urban guilds where with their, you know, like transmitted experience and accumulated experience through their craftsmanship, and then their artisans. And then we also have NGOs coming along as well. So we have lots of players that play working on a project. So I'm just wondering, were there any forms of challenges slash clashes, or in terms
You
of
know,
technology,
in
or
all countries,
yeah,
you have, let's say, the same players, more or less. Huh?
yeah,
They, you have a state, and basically most of your institutional agreements are with the state, huh? With the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Environment, or whatever. And you never know in advance how successful the relationship will be. So the first idea is to make a memo of understanding with the authorities for a 2-3 years cycle to test each other.
mm,
Then, once the institutional agreements are in place, then comes the community. And it is true that, I mean, you need to be very responsible as an NGO or international organization in not, let's say, trying to impose your way of working. Because simply if you start to impose something, people object to you. We have had this example also in Mali, that because we thought we were very comfortable about ourselves and our practice, they refused. The community refused, and the masons felt uncomfortable. So this is where we discovered, gradually speaking, that there was no other way to have a success in projects, to change the urban context and also the provide employment and improve the quality of the buildings and of the people, that than working with those people. You see, it's a, but things are very different if you work in Cairo, if you work in Kabul, if you work in Delhi, in very large cities where governmental institutions play a much stronger role.
yeah. Thank you for your answer. I mean, going back to maybe climate change and then what that poses, and then we see also lots of challenges when it comes to the solid waste management and all of these challenges, and then the floods around the city. Uh, I'm also wondering about this institutional urban, urban entities. Is there like a climate change awareness that is kind of driving their their intentions, like their actions to deal with these issues? Or I don't know if so when we talk, for example, about the waste management and then the
Yes.
thing with the floods, so is it driven by climate change threats and then the way they see climate change as a
Initially not, you see,
environment? Hmm.
because let's say those rather poor communities, they first look for employment opportunities,
Hmm.
training, getting, let's say, to transmit knowledge and train apprentices, and also have a better living
Hmm.
materially. So climate change is anyway available as a concept between as a criteria for work, simply because the resources are limited. And let's say vernacular architecture has also this kind of, let's say, lesson to teach us that, I mean, working with local materials as the closest circuit of material to the site is a way, let's say, to avoid simply, let's say, embedded carbon in the materials.
Mhm.
But we tend to have more interest for climate change and carbon reduction measures in very where most of our footprint is. You see, the footprint is not in Mali.
Mm.
The footprint is in big urban environment using lots of, let's say, transportation and also generators. So the and we are working a lot on, let's say, climate change and reduction measures, CO2 reduction measures in big cities like Lahore, Kabul, Delhi specifically.
Mm. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it looks like when it comes to climate change, those who kind of contribute the least suffer the more, maybe. And I think that equation also is right in Mali. It looks like I missed a part of Elizabeth's question, which was also a technical question about the roof of the mosque. So, was there any changes after the removal of excess roof load during the restoration work?
There was at least the possibility to access the beams.
Mm.
You see, and the load that was added was not playing any positive role to stabilize. It was simply overweighting certain areas and making the rainwater drainage impossible, simply because it had inverted the slopes. So the 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 real, let's say, durability of your work in a roof is really, let's say, to re, um, re improve the stability of the beams and create, let's say, a finished surface with regular slopes. So our slopes were in the order of 1.5 degrees, 1.5%, simply because you could not, let's say, due to the size of the roof, you could not, let's say, overload some areas to create stronger slopes. So it was a dilemma always to find a slope that is sufficient, but that would not, let's say, create an overloading.
Mm. Okay, I mean, if I don't know if we have any more questions.
Maybe I have one
Yeah,
more
sure.
question to go as the last one. Maybe there's a my question is about the pass on of the traditional knowledge of the building knowledge. So I see you mentioned in your presentation that there are less young people involved in these local guilds of masons. So do you think they have a sustainable like knowledge transmission to the young generations?
Yes, they do, simply because the population is very young. So the traditional bearers, the traditional masons, the 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 chief of the bariton, they are in their 50s, 60s. So they are rather senior people, and they cannot anymore, let's say, carry much loads and move around, but they are very good organizers. So they are the, let's say, the foremen, and they transfer knowledge thanks to projects. So they need projects to transfer knowledge. And the yearly maintenance campaign that you see on this picture is a yearly project that makes enough, let's say, activity to at least uh, permit the transmission of, and then I mean they also maintain, each house is being maintained every year, so new plaster is being added to each house in the city, and the city has 15,000 inhabitants, so there are plenty of, let's say, construction activities that take place, but they always take place under the leadership of a traditional mason and his apprentices. So his apprentices, he's the one who selects them. It's not, let's say, a vocational training system based on excellence or, let's say, competition. It's really, let's say, their decision to bring up more people from their family, from their relative, from the neighborhoods, and so on.
Thank you.
Okay, I think with that note, we can end this rich conversation. First, I want to thank you, Christophe, for such an enlightening and inspiring, as I said, presentation. And so we have a question here, which is the final note, is that if a person is asking if we want to get in touch with the Aga Khan Cultural Center regarding research.
Yes.
So what is the best place to start? I don't know if you want to just...
The best place to start, you see, we are a very small organization. We are big in our operations, but the headquarters is very small, you see. And basically, you can, if you need information, pictures, reports, anything that supports research, you can really contact me, simply, you see. And I do pass on the information to other colleagues in case. We generally, the difficulty is that we cannot provide much internship because our operations are in countries and we always give a priority to the people in the countries. You understand? And so that, I mean, we empower local professionals. But in terms of research, I mean, we have a database resource called arcnet.org. Maybe you know it. Arcnet.org has also is a source of knowledge that can also be interesting for you, and you can get also more pictures from us if you ask.
Yeah. So I just posted the two links in the chat for people to explore a bit of details about the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and arcnet.org. Well, I'll finally end with saying thank you for everyone who joined us today. And don't forget to join us next week on Tuesday.
Sorry, next week we don't have
Oh, sorry.
session. It's
Okay.
the week
So it will
after
be,
that.
yeah, so it will be on the 23rd of February. So not next week, the week after. Professor Biao Chiang. So we move from Mali to explore the vision of the nearby in contemporary Chinese cities. Please be with us. And yeah, thank you all for attending. And thank you again, Christo.
Thank you very much. That was a pleasure for me.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.